So we've sort of been watching how gases move from the mouth down to the alveoli. Now the alveoli then allows the gas to transfer across diffusion-wise into the bloodstream. And then what actually happens once the gas enters into the blood? It's the next part of the discussion. Now, the first one we tend to want to talk about is oxygen. Okay? Because, of course, that's the most important gas in our bloodstream. Ultimately, that's what is the last electron acceptor and is the one that is able to maintain steady oxygen levels in your mitochondria to maintain ATP production. Okay? Now, just make one more thing before we keep going as an announcement. This is some people have their phones on vibration. Okay? Try to shut that down completely. Don't let it vibrate unless you have an urgent phone call. And I could see that, but some people have their emails on it, and it vibrates, and it makes the table shake, and it bothers some of your other fellow classmates. So I would prefer that you don't do that anymore if you're doing that right now. So if you do have that on vibration, shut it down for now, and do that for me if you could. Okay? Otherwise, I'll have to say something else. I prefer not to. Okay? Anyways, let's go on to oxygen discussion. Okay? Now, because oxygen is a molecule that is small, it can get into the plasma and be absorbed, but basically dissolved into the plasma pretty well. The problem with it is it's not enough to oxygen basically to sustain life, so it's considered inadequate. The dissolved oxygen basically follows simple laws of diffusion, so it's basically moving from a high concentration area to a low concentration area. The normal gradient, remember, if you're looking at, is like 100 in the actual alveoli at sea level, and at FO2 is 21%. So normally in the bloodstream, you got maybe about 94 to 96 on the PaO2 values. That's all that's inside the dissolved blood. We measure that dissolved as the P(a)O2. Okay? Now, let's make sure that we understand what that really means. Okay? PaO2 basically means the pressure inside the artery of oxygen concentration. Okay? Just in millimeters of mercury, how much oxygen is dissolved in the plasma. Okay? It does not tell you anything what's going on inside the hemoglobin. It just tells you how much oxygen is dissolved in the plasma itself. Okay? Now, unfortunately, it knows this value, but they don't really know what it really means. What it means, basically, in clinical, it just tells you the health of the alveoli, how oxygen you are expecting is crossing over into the blood. And otherwise, clinically, it is relatively unimportant, okay, when you talk about life. For survival of people, you could be as much as PaO2 of 600. Jeez, don't do it now. Hold on. I have to answer this. Yeah. Okay. All right, thanks, man. I'll call you later. Bye-bye. My daughter's getting chemo today, so I had to answer. Sorry. Anyways. Where was that? Okay. So when you're looking at oxygen levels that dissolve, they're really clinically not important. Okay, why are they clinically not important? Because what really is the important part that carries the oxygen to your cells is the hemoglobin. Okay? You can actually have a perfect PaO2 value of 600 on a blood gas. And if your hemoglobin is 2 because you bled out, you're dead. Okay? You'll die. So even though you can have very high PaO2 values, it does not mean that you have enough oxygen carrying capacity. Now, the way oxygen transfers in and out follows simply Henry's law, which is a gas law. Okay? Pretty simple. And the other thing that also is important is that oxygen levels, once it gets to a certain point, it's pretty flat. Okay? So once you get above 60 or 90, okay, you turn the corner, and then you really can't, there's not much more that you're going to be carrying-wise in capacity. What we actually use is a calculation for actual how much oxygen ends up being delivered. Okay? is PaO2 times 0.003 milliliters of oxygen per 100 milliliters of blood. That is an extremely low number. Okay, when we talk about the oxygen carrying capacity, which is the CaO2 times, which is equal to the hemoglobin times the 1.39 times the saturation plus PaO2 times 0.003. In clinical, we actually throw this portion of the equation out. We don't even use it. Okay, so that's how insignificant it is. Now, that we carry
blood, oxygen in our blood, is through the hemoglobin.
Now, what bothers me again is that the books don't explain to you what really hemoglobin is. How many people could say to me, what is hemoglobin really?
Draw it. How many people could actually be able to sit here and draw it? My first question is where? Okay, so it's in a truck. Okay? The truck is a red blood cell. How much of the truck contains hemoglobin? 2%, 5%, 10%, 20%, 30%, 40%, 50%, 60%, 80%, 90%, 100%. How much is inside the truck? Again, how many times have you read about hemoglobin? You should be so comfortable with this stuff that it should be coming out of your ears, right? I mean, I must have heard this lecture at least 20 times in your career so far, right? All the way from high school, RN school, now percent. Per volume. That's a huge amount. Okay, so mostly the red blood cell is all hemoglobin. 80% of its weight is hemoglobin. That's a huge amount. Now, what's the hemoglobin doing inside the red blood cell? Is it in a specialized organelle sitting around going like, yeah, no, it's floating. It's floating in the cytosol. So these hemoglobin molecules are like little catcher's mitts that are just floating inside the actual water in the cytoplasm. Okay? The way I want you to think about it is go outside, okay, and look at this river, okay, that's outside here. And on that river you have on top of it a bunch of leaves. Okay? Well, those leaves are the hemoglobin molecule in your mind now. Okay? But now we're going to make it something interesting. We're going to take that molecule and pack it into a truck. And that leaf has the ability to change its shape. It can fold up or unfold. And as it folds up and unfolds, it accepts oxygen or lets it go. Okay? So in other words, it's a catcher's mitt that can change its shape depending on what it wants to catch. Okay? If I'm at the lung level, I want to pull in all the oxygen I can. So the configuration will change to open up to accept oxygen molecules. Okay? And then when I go down to the tissue level, the actual will change. And will now molecules that drop out, but then it accepts something bigger onto it, which is carbon dioxide. So it exchanges the gas. Pretty cool. So this guy not only can carry one thing, it can also carry another thing, which is carbon dioxide. Now, hemoglobin is so efficient, okay, because of the mass amount of volume in it. Okay? Which cell in your body has the greatest number of body? Red blood cells. Red blood cells. Think about it. If you're going to be carrying a lot of stuff around, you better have a lot of worker bees or a lot of trucks. Okay, so if you're talking about individual cells that are basically specialized to do one job, which one has the highest number? And it's red blood cells. They're huge in numbers. Okay? And at which inside the truck you have 80% capacity, which means that you have, the way I think about a hemoglobin molecule is I think of him as one of these postal trucks. I'm going to take a picture of it one day. And the postal truck has a cab in it.
The cab is where the driver is going to be at. That's about 20% of the volume. And then the rest is where I'm going to have my oxygen capacity, which is 80% per weight, which is actually, sorry, let me erase this. This little guy's got 60% per weight, and then it's got a little extra little carrier behind it, which is 20%. Okay, so when you look at the value is 1.39. This is one part here, and this is the 0.39 part. Okay, so we talk about the next part of the equation, which is the actual hemoglobin carrying capacity. You know, just think about the analogy of a truck. Okay, how full I fill up the truck with oxygen will be what we call saturation. Okay, saturation. If I'm 100% full, I'm basically 100% saturated, right? Okay. If I tell you that I have hemoglobin is the number of trucks that we have. The normal hemoglobin value that we have is around 14 to 15 if you're a male. Women carry a hemoglobin around 12. Okay? If we increase the numbers of trucks, then we have more oxygen that can be delivered significantly. And if we also, normally we try to carry the trucks pretty full, so we're usually about 100% saturated most of the time. Now the 1.39 is a description of how big the truck carrying capacity space is. And when you read different books, you'll get different values. If you're with the Brits use 1.34, because in some of the newer texts are now using 1.32, but in the United States we use 1.39. So 1.39 is what you're going to be expected to know for your test. Okay? Now, what's really cool about hemoglobin is you can also change the actual leaves, which is the hemoglobin molecule inside the trucks, by changing their way to bind to different affinity. Okay? In other words, you can go to outside there and you can see different kinds of plants. Well, the plant that initially is born has what we call hemoglobin F, which is a fetal hemoglobin. It's a molecule that binds to oxygen more readily, and then as you become an adult, you have what's called hemoglobin A.
Have in our bloodstream, which is not as much aggressive as pulling oxygen into it, but it's also more likely than hemoglobin F to give up the oxygen to tissue, which is why we like it as an adult. Okay? It's also good because when a woman's pregnant, she has hemoglobin A in her bloodstream, and the baby has hemoglobin F. So which way does oxygen go? Baby's hemoglobin has a higher affinity to oxygen, so it's going to suck. It's going to literally pull the oxygen out of mom and go into its hemoglobin. Okay? So that's why you have that difference. Okay? If baby had the same hemoglobin as a mother, if he had hemoglobin A, what do you think would happen to the baby? He'd starve for oxygen and die. Okay, which happens once in a while. You'll see a baby basically die at 36 weeks because of conversion. For some reason, we don't understand why, the baby converted from hemoglobin F to hemoglobin A too early, and then the kid dies in utero. Okay, that's rare, though. Hemoglobin A contains in it iron. Okay? Iron is which is called ferrous. The actual ion is the one that actually takes up the oxygen. Okay? The ferrous does not take up oxygen. And you can convert ferrous to ferric by different things binding to it. Okay? You can bind to it and form what's called methemoglobin. Met for things like nitrites, sulfonamides, acetanilide, and hurricane spray, which is cytokine spray, will convert from ferrous to the ferric. Okay?
Or not a good thing. If you give somebody cytokine spray aggressively, too much so, you will see a rapid desaturation on your patient. And that actually is a true desaturation. Okay? That person will actually have no more oxygen affinity once the stuff binds to this. Now, how do you reverse methemoglobin? You give methylene blue. Why would methylene blue work? Methylene blue is a dye, right? Why would it work? What methylene blue does is it does not bind to hemoglobin. It is
basically highly dissolved in the plasma, though. And it has a tremendous ability to convert. It can bind to molecules that are bound to cause this methemoglobin to be pulled away from the hemoglobin. In other words, it creates a sump of a charge inside the plasma, but doesn't get into the hemoglobin. If methylene blue actually attached to the hemoglobin, it would be considered a poison and would be deadly. Okay, but in this case, it stays dissolved in the plasma, so it acts as a sink to pull away the molecules that are bound to the hemoglobin, allowing the reversal of methemoglobin. Okay? That's a commonly asked exam question, so make sure you're aware of that. Now, so basically when you look at hemoglobin, I want you to think of it as a truck with an extended compartment. It's one truck plus 0.39 of a truck, then how many trucks you have, and then how full your trucks are. That's your equation. That's your CaO2 equation. It's your carrying oxygen capacity equation. And it's two parts, okay? But the most important part is this one, which is the actual hemoglobin carrying capacity. Okay, so it's when you're looking at what's called CaO2, it's two parts. One's going to be the truck factory, and then the other one's going to be what's in the plasma. And this is in the hemoglobin. Hemoglobin is going to be 1.39 times the hemoglobin times the saturation plus 0.003 times the PaO2. When we're doing this equation in clinical, this is not important. Okay, the value is insignificant. Does anybody not understand that? It is critical for the rest of your career to know what I just explained this to you. If you do not understand this concept, it will come back to bite you. It will hurt somebody in clinical as well. Everybody gets it? Yes, sir. The PaO2? What you're looking at the blood gas, you're looking at PaO2 normally. Okay? It doesn't usually give you CaO2 because unless it measures hemoglobin, then it will give you the CaO2. Okay? Because it knows the saturation and knows the hemoglobin concentration, so it can come up with a value of CaO2. Most people don't know that number though, okay? Although that's the most critical value. Okay? What we look at as clinicians is we usually look at hemoglobin concentration and saturation. If those values are both good, then you tend to have adequate amount of CaO2. Okay? PaO2 basically means nothing, except to tell you how healthy the alveoli are. It tells you about diffusion impairments. It tells you about VQ inequality. It tells you about dead space, and it gives you an idea about shunt. Okay? But that's really it. It doesn't really tell you what's being carried to the tissue. Okay, so one is, when you're looking at PaO2, it's a way of identifying pathological problems that are in the lung. Okay? But when you talk about oxygenation, about how oxygen is getting from the lung to the tissue, what you really care about is the CaO2, which is the 1.39 times the hemoglobin times the saturation. Okay? Yes, it does. Right, it gives you SaO2. What a blood gas usually does is it splits it up into, you should look at it in two different ways. One's oxygenation and the other one's ventilation. Okay, so when I look at oxygenation, I look at PaO2, SaO2, CaO2. Those are all oxygenation values. Okay? If I'm looking at ventilation problems, then I look at CO2, pH, and bicarb. Okay, those are all interrelated with that section. So I split up my blood gases into parts, and then I look at individual components that basically glean the maximum information out of it that I can. Okay? And different things will give me different sets of information. If I see that my CaO2, my hemoglobin is good, my saturation is good, but my PaO2 is low, that means that that person's still okay clinically, but that person is also pathologically something bad is happening at the alveolar level. And I need to address it before it becomes a problem on the oxygen carrying capacity side of it.
Okay? It could be that the person's forming early pulmonary edema, which means I just need to give them a little Lasix, dry them out a little bit, and everything gets better. It could be that I've mainstemmed and intubated that individual, and I need to listen to breath sounds bilaterally if I think I'm seeing shunt. See how I'm trying to differentiate out the problem list. Okay? This is what we hopefully will incorporate. You need to understand this, so when we talk about this further in clinical, or when we talk about it in the sim lab, we can begin to split up these concepts and show you, okay, this is the blood gas value that you have. Tell me what's going on. And that's one of the things we're going to make you do, which is something we haven't done before. The transition step is usually done in clinical, when you get an abnormal blood gas, but then you're so far distant from this lecture that you don't remember it. That's the downside to it. You need to have some practical application to make this stuff make sense. Okay? And trust me, these are not easy concepts. I know that. Okay? It took me a long time to figure out how this stuff works. Okay? And it didn't come easy. And it took me a while. Okay? So I don't expect you to know it overnight. But you do have a good base, so you can keep working on it. Okay? No, it's a different measurement. It's based on FIC in a certain degree because FIC is cardiac output. So that's the next part, which is delivery. D.O2 is what you're talking about. Okay? D.O2 has to do with delivery and carrying capacity. Okay, that's a two-part equation. So when one goes down, then your delivery goes down. Okay, so we'll talk about that a little bit later on. Now, the next part that we talk about is called the oxygen dissociation curve. That becomes a favorite question.
And that's a really good question. Where does it take? All right, here's what happens when you pre-oxygenate. When you take your alveolar level PaO2 from 100, now you drop it up to 660. Okay? So that's your new store. For when you stop ventilating that individual, the PaO2 is maximal. It's at 600 sitting there in the alveoli. Okay? Now, as the blood begins to extract oxygen and use it up, okay, the venous returning oxygen levels are lower, so it just pulls it from the alveoli. And it keeps pulling it, pulling it, pulling it, pulling it. And it keeps doing it until eventually the PaO2 values begin to fall below the venous level. Once they're at the same level as the venous return as the alveolar level, then diffusion stops. Just liberation takes place. So then, at that point, your sats begin to fall. Because now your blood is coming out. It's no longer arterial, it's now venous. The venous is arterial. The venous concentration is going to be the same thing as the arterial concentration that leaves along. Okay, so where it's pulling the stuff out is from the alveoli. Okay, even though you're not ventilating, it's still a store. The bigger your FRC, the longer your store value is. Basically, you can think about FRC as tank size. The bigger your FRC, the better your tank size is, and the more oxygen you have for reserve. Make sense? Okay. Now, the next thing that is going to come into play is the oxygen dissociation curve. The oxygen dissociation curve is a favorite for a C exam and for certification exam. And it's also a favorite for me because it gives you an idea about what's going on at the hemoglobin level inside the red blood cell. What's really hard to explain to people is this kind of constant change that's taking place. I need to get an animation one day to do this, but anyways, what the oxygen dissociation curve is basically describing to you is how the hemoglobin interacts with oxygen, and as well as how plasma interacts with oxygen. So there's actually 3 axes on the oxygen dissociation curve, which is kind of strange. There's 2 y-axes and 1 x. On the x-axis, you have the PaO2. On the y-axis on one side, you have the saturation, and the axis on the left side of the y-axis is going to be your CaO2. Okay? And then your curves inside this thing are 2 of them. There's an oxygen dissociation curve, which is due to hemoglobin,
and there's an actual plasma concentration curve, which is not a curve, it's a line. Okay, I'll show you that in a minute. It's actually considered a curve, but when you look at the actual picture of it, it looks linear, but it's not, because it follows this down here. See this value, this line down here? We'll show you that in the picture in the oxygen dissociation curve here in a minute. Okay? So there's three parts to the oxygen dissociation curve: your carrying capacity, your PaO2, and your saturation. Okay? So this is your friend. You have to memorize this. Okay? But in other words, what does it really mean? Okay, so let's go through it one piece at a time and really take our time and slow down and talk about this thing. Let's most likely spend here about 10 minutes on it than normal. So let's look at the X curve, the X line first. This is your X line, and on the X line you're going to have your PaO2. Okay, and the PaO2 is, of course, what is the oxygen that's actually dissolved in your plasma. Okay, but it's also basically what can be dissolved inside your hemoglobin, inside your cytosol, inside your red blood cell. Okay, so you have this line here. Okay, the next line, which is your Y line, so I'm going to make it in red, is your saturation line, which is over here. That's your sat. That's your hemoglobin saturation. And then you have on the other end over here, which I'm going to make in blue, is you're going to be your CaO2. That's your oxygen concentration, milliliters per 100 milliliters of blood. Okay? Now, that's the first thing. Does that make sense? Did I lose anybody? So there's two y-axes and one x. Okay? Now, there is two curves inside this picture. Okay, let's show you the two different curves. You have this guy down here, and it's a dotted line. That is actually the same line as this. But the reason you don't see it that way is because it appears linear when you make it really, the variable is really insignificant how much your oxygen is carrying. Okay, so the dissolved plasma value is very, very insignificant to the total amount of what can be carried by the hemoglobin. So this is the part of the equation that we call PaO2 times 0.003. See how that's almost insignificant? This plus this is equal to your CaO2, right? So that bottom line is really pretty much insignificant. Okay? So a lot of times, most people won't even lecture to you about it. They'll just tell you, well, the oxygen is down the bottom, but they don't explain it to you very well. But that's what it is. That dissolved oxygen in the plasma. And also in the cytosol of the red blood cell. It's insignificant. Okay? Now, on the other hand, this graph above you, okay, is kind of different. This thing looks like this. Okay, that's the oxygen dissociation curve, okay, for hemoglobin. This is how hemoglobin is taking up oxygen and letting it go. Now, something should jump out at you. Okay? At least it did to me when I first saw it. Almost in any physiologic discussion you have, okay, when you talk about efficiency, okay, when you talk about muscle efficiency, cardiac performance, respiratory performance, you always come up with a curve, and that we call a compliance curve. Doesn't this look like a compliance curve to you? It looks like Starling's curve in a way, doesn't it? Okay, so there's something inherent about having a curve that's this shape to brings a lot of efficiency to it. Okay? And what I'm trying to tell you is that the hemoglobin is extremely efficient to uptake oxygen. Okay? Once it gets above this level, okay, can any more hemoglobin bind to oxygen? It's on the flat portion of the curve.
So at that point, the oxygen is uptaken to its maximum level. In other words, I've got my trucks sitting outside, okay? And we got our postal trucks of 1.39, so they're big trucks, okay? And then I'm going to have all of you guys out there with putting boxes into it. So you're going to put all the boxes into it, and I'm going to give you, let's say, 30,000 boxes to put into the trucks, okay? But the capacity of the truck is only 500 boxes. What's the rest of the boxes going to do? They're going to sit outside. And that's what happens when you have excess amount of oxygen. You've already filled up the trucks to the maximum level, but now they're just sitting outside the truck. They're going to be, if it starts pouring down and some of them fall into the river, they're now dissolved in the plasma. Are they really efficiently going to get to wherever I want it to get to? No. It's sitting still in the parking lot. Okay? So even though the PaO2 values are going up, it doesn't mean that the hemoglobin or filling up the truck is any more efficient at that point. You've already hit maximal point of filling. Okay? Now, that being said, okay, the hemoglobin, okay, has certain points on it that are really critical for you to understand. Okay? There's certain points on it that you have to memorize. Okay? The example of that is at 90% saturation. Okay? The value for the PaO2 at that point should be 60. So 60, 90 saturation. Now, why is that important? Okay, here's why it's important. Because you need to have this thing in your head. You need to have this image in your mind. When all of a sudden your patient goes to 90% saturation, it isn't time to sit there and conjecture, should I ventilate this individual? Okay? Because look where I'm at. Imagine that you're a guy on the edge of a precipice. Okay? Where would you rather be? I know where I want to be. I want to be on the top of the hill, all the way on the top. I don't want to be messing anywhere near the end of the cliff. Okay, so as long as I'm up there, I got somewhere to play. I can run around up there, no problem. But I come down to the 90% mark, okay? Now I'm looking over the edge and looking, it looks awful sharp dropping from there. And if I don't do something like push you back up the hill very quickly by giving you additional oxygen, then the saturation is going to go from 90 to 60 like that before you know it. Now, when you look at a pulse oximeter, right? How many of you opened up the software inside and looked at it? Wow. How many of you know how long it takes a pulse oximeter to create the magical number you see? How long? Very good. That's 8 seconds is the normal one with the high-speed Nellcor ones that we use nowadays. Had it been 5 years ago, you would have said 15 to 30 seconds. Okay? So at least you have a rapid responding pulse oximeter that's still 8 seconds behind. Let's think about that. That's 8 seconds behind what? What's it behind 8 seconds? That means that's when it reaches your finger, right? So if it's reading 90% here on my finger, what's my alveoli doing if it's still dropping? It's going off the cliff. Okay, so my lungs, on the other hand, could be at 30%, and this is not going to take but several seconds to get here. How long does it take the heart from pumping out of my lungs to my finger? 30 seconds. So I have 38-second delay. So if I see a saturation of 90%, it isn't the time to think about it. It's the time to jump on the patient and start ventilating them. Okay? I was teaching this to somebody the other day. They were looking at me like, Dr. Nolan, why are you so excited? And I said, get on it. Get the person oxygenated. Put the oxygen mask on. Start ventilating. And they go, what? Everything will be fine. He says, watch. All of a sudden, I'm going, and he starts going, freaking out. Oh, my God! It's like, yeah, a little bit behind, aren't you, huh? You're 35 seconds behind, okay? So, and then the guy had bradycardia. It was really significant, and we almost arrested the guy, okay?
So you got to be aware that you're off the curve. Okay, once you hit 90%, the curve drops like a stone. And you're way behind the 8 ball because the machines that we have are 38 seconds behind real time. At best. At best. Okay? Everybody's heard in this room that kids become bradycardic. Usually adults become tachycardic and hypoxemia. In children, they become severely bradycardic and they go in asystole. And everybody tells you, oh, you give atropine, it solves the problem. I said, no, it doesn't solve the problem. It just masks the problem. Okay? All you're doing is hiding the problem that you're actually getting hypoxemic. Because in the old days, the Nellcores were so delayed, the kids were desaturating on us like stones, and we weren't picking it up. We'd see it on their face, it turned blue. By the time we picked it up, it was already too late. The patient was already trying to die on us. So we want to avoid those kind of situations. So this oxygen dissociation curve is very helpful to tell you where that inflection point is. So now it's pretty important. Okay? There's also a value called the P50. Okay? P50 for most individual adults is at 27. Okay? So P50 is a 50% mark. Okay? So you're at 27. So that's going to be that's the P50. Okay? There's other values I'm going to make you memorize in a second, but those are the big ones I want you to memorize. 90, 60. Now 90, 60 you can never forget. I mean, if you forget this one, you've got brain dead, okay? You need to think about this one, okay? How do you remember 60, 90? Flip the 6 over. Okay, it's a 9. Okay, it looks like a 9. Okay, that's how I remember it. It's so simple. If you can't remember that, I don't know. You shouldn't miss a test question for that. I had somebody miss a board question like that. I looked at him like, okay, come on. That one was silly. Okay, don't waste your good ones on simple ones like that. Now, the other thing you can do to the curve to describe it is you can shift the curve. And that's where it's tricky for students. Okay? This curve doesn't sit in the same spot. It moves. And you go like, what? How does it move? And the answer is it moves based on where your hemoglobin's at in your bloodstream. The way we actually always draw an oxygen dissociation curve is when it's in the lung. So when you're looking at this, this is a typical person with oxygen in the lung and hemoglobin in the lung. That's a normal oxygen dissociation curve. But as it moves towards the tissue, it shifts. Okay? And it shifts this way. Okay? So it dives down. Now, why does it do that? The reason it does that is it unloads the oxygen. It's trying to get rid of the oxygen off the hemoglobin. If you didn't have that ability, the oxygen would just stay bound to the hemoglobin. It'd be happy, but your tissue would die. Okay, so it has to have a way to change its shape to be able to shift this curve and cause it to be able to dissociate the oxygen off the hemoglobin. Okay, so now let's go into all the different ways that oxygen dissociation curves can do. Okay, so let's do the first one. Okay. The oxygen dissociation curve can go up and down. Okay, you're going like, what? How does that happen? Okay, how does it go up? And the answer is, all you have to do is to go make it go up higher, is to add what? What's the only value that can change here? That really can change in number is hemoglobin. So if I increase hemoglobin, I'm going up. If I decrease hemoglobin, I'm going down. I'm still going to be, this number here will drop down. This will still be 100% saturation, but my carrying capacity will drop. Okay? Does that make sense? Always got to be aware of that. Okay, so I'm going to show you a picture of that. So this is your curve shifting up and down based on your CO2 content. You can see the saturation, okay, is still remaining 100% at each one of the top of these curves. But the ability for your oxygen to carry, concentration-wise, they flipped it on this example, is going down as you become more anemic. And this is what happens in the operating room all the time. When patients begin to hemorrhage, your oxygen carrying capacity begins to fall. So what happens to the person's ability to perform a metabolic acidosis? It goes up because oxygen becomes depleted at the tissue level. So the person goes anaerobic. Okay? So this is why it's important for you to understand that hemoglobin, ultimately, you have to have adequate amounts. The other thing, too, that happens, if you poison the hemoglobin with carbon monoxide, your saturation appears to be okay because it can fool the SpO2. It won't fool the saturation on the SaO2, which is the co-oximeter, but it will fool most pulse oximeters. Okay, but if you look at the oxygen carrying capacity of somebody that has carbon monoxide poisoning, you see a very significant drop, even though the hemoglobin is staying fixed. Yes? For carbon monoxide, you can. That's actually a very difficult question to answer. The first time we actually had protocols for giving blood was 1989. So it's not like it's old, okay? The answer is difficult to give you because it depends on the rate of bleeding. It depends on the physiologic response to the patient. Now, if you're a healthy individual in your 20s and you don't want to get HIV because you're worried about getting blood, and your hemoglobin drops to 7, would I give you a unit of blood? No, not unless you get hypotensive and tachycardic. But on the other hand, if I had somebody who was 90 years old with 3-vessel coronary disease, I would transfuse you at a hemoglobin 9 or higher sometimes. Because if you become slightly symptomatic, I start pumping you full of blood because I don't want your coronaries to basically not have enough oxygen being delivered to the heart. So the answer is very variable on who you ask. Most of us look at the value, absolute value around 8. That's where we significantly say, you need to give that person blood. That's where most of us start getting uncomfortable. Okay? But is it absolute? No. No. I've had somebody come in with a hemoglobin of 12, and everybody said, oh, the guy doesn't need blood transfusion. I said, no, he needs 6 units right now. So you can be fooled by hemoglobin, too. I mean, this person had bled out 2.5 liters in their belly, and they were not diluting it out yet. They hadn't been given any fluid yet. So sometimes packed RB, sometimes your values that you're getting from your blood testing is because a person is losing plasma at a greater rate than they're losing blood cells. So be careful. Absolute numbers are difficult to sometimes come up with. The tip-off is usually that the person's getting hypotensive and tachycardic. That's usually the time when you have to give blood, for sure. By that point, you're a little bit behind. Okay. Now, the curve, in addition to that, can shift right or left. Okay? And this is what confuses people. What do you mean by right shift? Okay? A right shift is going which way? Okay? So let's go into the right shift. Okay? A right shift decreases the oxygen affinity. Okay? So what you do is, you have to be looking at the paper. So you're looking at the paper and put your, here's what I do. Because I'm sometimes dumb, because I do R on one hand and do an F, L on the other. Okay? Because unfortunately for me, everything in my life is right-handed. And this is my right hand. Why? Because I'm left-handed. Okay? So when I take a test, because everything to me is always opposite, I always put an R and an L in my hand. If that's cheating, oh well. Too damn bad. Okay? Okay? So if the curve is going to, when I put my hand on the paper, when I do these tests, okay, right shift means it's going this way. Left shift means it's going this way. That's simple. Okay? Which way is your hand going to go, left or right? Okay? So if you're talking about a right shift, I'm taking my curve and I'm pushing it down. Okay? A right shift occurs when you're going from the lung
towards the tissue. Okay, so what could be another way of describing this? Well, the analogy that I like to describe to people so they make some more sense to them is imagine that you're going on vacation. Okay, and in vacation, where do most of you guys want to go to vacation? Tell me some of your vacation spots. Central America, okay, why? Beach, warm, nice weather, blue sky, right? Okay, so he's perfect, he's a lung, okay? How many people go on vacation at one time in your office? 1 out of maybe 10 or 15 or 30? So it's a very small percentage, okay? So there's really not a lot of workers there. Most workers are sitting in their office working, okay? So you're sitting in your lung, he's in his vacation, he's sitting out in the sun, he's going, nice life, no smog, nothing, it's nice clean air, pure oxygen's there, perfect, okay? Now we're going to put him into a company that produces high amount of steel or something, okay? So as he begins to produce stuff, and he goes back to his work, he's going to have a lot of fellow workers with him. And at this new site, he's also going to be producing a lot of heat, okay, because he's manufacturing stuff. And he's also going to produce carbon dioxide, okay, because as he's smelting steel, he's going to produce more carbon dioxide. So how does that apply to this curve? Well, your trucks are moving from a vacation spot, which is in the lungs, where there's a high oxygen affinity, okay, cooler temperature, kind of nice because you're out in the open, okay. There's no fellow workers, so there's no 2,3-DPG around. So the ability for oxygen binding is high, and pH is actually higher than normal. But now, as you go towards the tissue, where you're going towards the factories, now you have a dissociation towards the right. You shift the curve, which is going to pull the load of oxygen out the truck. The way you're going to do that is you're going to have lots of workers. So there's going to be a lot of 2,3-DPGs. Okay? You're going to have also elevated CO2. That's going to help push the stuff off the truck. And we're going to have a low pH. Okay? And also we're going to have an increase in temperature. So warmth, heat from the factory, because you're in the factory floor. See how that analogy works? You don't have to memorize it, just have to think of it that way. Okay? It kind of makes sense. You can't miss these test questions otherwise. Okay? So whatever pushes you towards going to an industrial park is what's going to make you unload your oxygen off your truck. Elevated 2,3-DPG, low pH, high CO2, and high temperatures. Okay? What's on the other hand is going to shift your curve back to the left, where you're going to have more oxygen uptake, is going to be cooler temperature, lower CO2, higher pH, and no 2,3-DPG. Okay? Does that make sense? Hopefully you'll remember that. Okay, so here's what your friend is doing. This is a person which is on a cooler temperature, 20 degrees versus 38 degrees. You see the curve shifts that way. Okay, so right shift is going with a higher CO2, and a lower pH is going towards a shift to the right. Okay, so these are the examples that you should know for your test. Okay, now here's what I think is missing in this whole picture. Let me give you an example of what this does. So this is a right shift. Okay, so my hand's on the, pushing it to the right. Okay. Right hand, pushing it to the right. Okay, that's a right shift. Now what does that really do? Okay, so let's say my cytosol concentration was here, was when we started that. Okay, now when I went down to the tissue level, what's going to happen to all my boxes inside that level? That means it's going to start falling straight down. So at this point, all these boxes that were in the truck before are now what? They're unloaded. They're into the tissue. So in other words, the bigger that curve is on the inside, that separation of the curve, that means there's more delivery. Does that make sense? Just think about all this area in here. All this area in here is all boxes that were in the truck before. Now you've unloaded them into the tissue, or into the capillary, which then is going to give it to the tissue. Okay? Does that make sense? Now, that means that my truck has space. For what?
I mean, I don't know about you, but if you carry a load one direction, you want to bring something back with you because then you make double the money. Okay? So what you fill it with is another gas. The gas you fill it up with is carbon dioxide. So carbon dioxide is also carried in the hemoglobin. Does it do it efficiently? Hell no. It's not very efficient at all. Okay? But it is doing something. It's doing a little bit of work. Now, let me give you an example. I'm going to stop here in a few seconds. And we still got a long way to go in this section. So I got next week kind of free, so I'm going a little slower, trying to explain this stuff in more detail. If you look at oxygen in your bloodstream, how much oxygen do you have in your bloodstream? Do you know? You actually have 1.2 liters of oxygen in your bloodstream. How much CO2 do you have in your bloodstream? 120 liters. Okay? So that's a lot of difference. Okay? Well, here's what's really cool if you understand this. Okay? If I have 1.2 liters of oxygen, and my consumption rate of oxygen is around 250 cc's, how long can I live without oxygen? 250 goes into 1.2, 5 minutes, which is why we die at 5 minutes without oxygen. Now, if I were to give you more oxygen in your alveoli and I give you more reserve, then what happens to my oxygen stores? They go up. So then I can live up to 8 to 10 minutes without oxygen. Okay, so when you look at the oxygen dissociation curve, the useful anchor points that you have to memorize for your exam are the following. The 90-60 one I just talked to you about, and also the P50, which is the 27, are the ones you absolutely have to know for sure. But you have to also know the 75-40 and the 97-100 is the other variables that I think you should know. When you take your final exam, if one of the, it doesn't always happen, but every once in a while I throw up the oxygen dissociation curve as one of the questions. And I expect you to draw it with these points in mind. Okay, so if you don't draw it based on these points, I take points off. Okay, so this is the oxygen dissociation points for the anchor points are at the lung level. So this is when your oxygen is fully loaded inside in your lung. Yes? Okay, 75, let me go back to the other curve. Go back to that one. Wow, I almost had a heart attack, that one. Let's blank it out. Whoops. Okay. So the 90, 60 is here. Okay. So this is 90% over 60. Then you have your 75, which is, this is 70, 75 is here. Okay, and it comes down here. Okay, which is that other value, which is 47. So you have 75, 47. And then you have your 50 rule, which is 27, 50, 27. That's the ones you have to memorize for sure. And then you have the 97%, which is up here, which is somewhere 100. 75, 40. It depends on who you read. I just use 75, 40. Just use 75, 40 for the test. I keep it a simpler one. Some of the British will say 75, 47. So I go back and forth, sorry, in my head. So 75, 40, just use whatever I wrote in the last two tests. Then the 100 is 97, is 97% saturated, is at 100 PaO2. Okay? So PaO2 of 97% is at 100. Okay, that's what that one is. So that's where you have to sort of put the points at, see? Okay. Does that make sense? Or did I not make that? Right, that's when this portion of the curve right here. Yeah, they're desaturating like a stone. Okay, they're at 75%, and then they're at 50%, which the pulse oximeter no longer measures at that point, and then you're dying. At 50%, you start dying. Right. As you get lower in the saturation, then you begin to die.
you can still be alive at 75% saturated. And some people are in mountains, high mountains, are 75% saturated and still okay. But once you hit 60% or less, you're getting into that critical area where you start to die. 50%, you're in a bad place. You shouldn't be there. Literally what it means is that, let's take this, okay? Let me give you an example. Let's back it up. Let's give you a real-time example. Okay, right here. Okay? This person, let's say, is at a hemoglobin of 20. Okay? Right? And that person is at that percent, he's 100% saturated. So his value here for carrying capacity is around 25. Not a big deal. Okay? He's doing great. He's very happy. Now, give him a situation where he now becomes 50% of that. So in other words, drop his stats by 50%. So you're going to drop it down to, that's 100%. Now he's going to be 50% saturated. Okay? That individual is still got adequate levels of oxygen carrying capacity. So even though you're at 50%, that individual will still be okay. But what happens if you're anemic already? Let's say you're at a hemoglobin of 10. Let's say you're here. And then you drop that individual down to 50%. Now look what happened to your carrying capacity. Now you're into danger zone. Now you're not delivering enough oxygen to the tissue. That's another way of looking at it. Okay? So when people give you absolutes, there is no absolutes. There's so many variables. You have to consider everything in place. You have to see how much hemoglobin you got on board. That's how some people can tolerate being at such high altitudes and being desaturated. They're still having enough carrying capacity because their hemoglobin values are so high. Now, what's a big problem about being at such high hemoglobins? Viscosity becomes a big issue, okay? And anytime a red blood cell ruptures, the count of hemoglobin inside that red blood cell is tremendous. So there's more likely to develop renal failure. There's, the level of hemoglobin molecules that get broken apart. So you see different effects. All right, now when you look at carbon monoxide and hemoglobin, they form a binding called carboxyhemoglobin, which has 240 times the affinity of carbon monoxide to oxygen to the hemoglobin molecule. So once that happens, basically you're poisoning the truck. Okay? And the chance of you getting that carbon monoxide is going to be pretty small, unless you really make it, push it off by giving higher and higher levels of oxygen. This basically causes the oxygen dissociation curve to shift to the left. So basically, the carbon monoxide has so much greater affinity that it doesn't want to allow the actual hemoglobin to change its configuration to accept oxygen molecules anymore. Now, this is what occurs at the tissue level, at the lung on the top, and then how it turns around and comes back the other way via the vein back to the lung. Okay, so in this situation, if you look at the top of this picture, it's a nice graphical representation. Oxygen diffuses through the alveolar membrane, goes through the capillary membrane, and eventually goes into the cytoplasm in the plasma. This is what we call the dissolved plasma PaO2. That would be right here. That would be P(a)O2. It also will then cross over into the actual red blood cell membrane, and then it will also partly dissolve inside the cytosol, inside the cytoplasm of the red blood cell. What is the concentration of the cytoplasm concentration and the plasma concentration? I know that was kind of confusing. Let me try it again. What is the PaO2 here, and what would be inside here, which we call it C, which is cytoplasm O2? It'd be the same. They're absolutely the same. Okay? So when people ask you, well, is there diffusion, is there differences? No, it's the same. It equilibrates almost immediately. So whatever your PaO2 is both what's going on inside the plasma as well as inside the cytoplasm of that red blood cell. Okay? But that's still really not where the oxygen is carried at. Where the oxygen is carried at, if you were to take this per weight, okay, and measure the weight, 80% of this would be hemoglobin. So all that volume that you see,
80% per volume, or 80% per weight, is hemoglobin. That's a huge amount. There's a lot of hemoglobin inside a red blood cell. Okay? Notice one thing about red blood cell. What does it not have? It's got no nucleus. It's got no organelles. It's got nothing. It's pretty much empty, except for the major hemoglobin, which is inside of it. Okay? Now, the oxygen binds to it, okay, and basically binds to the ferrous component, okay, and then it transfers downstream based on cardiac output to eventually get to the tissue level. Once the tissue levels, they're low on oxygen, so they begin to pull the oxygen out simply by diffusion again, okay, because you're going down a gradient, okay. The other thing that helps unload the oxygen is that hydrogen ions come in to help unload the oxygen off the hemoglobin, okay. And the other thing that will also, so it's low pH, will cause the hemoglobin. And the other thing that also will help unbind it is 2,3-DPG, which also extracts the oxygen and pulls it towards the cells, okay. The cells themselves are producing, as due to metabolism, carbon dioxide, okay. Carbon dioxide is going to go to 3 places. It's going to go partly to dissolved, okay, which is in the plasma, which is when we draw a blood gas in CA, what's the PaCO2? That's the dissolved dissolved CO2 in your plasma. Is that the greatest amount that you're carrying in your blood? No, it's the smallest of all things. You would think, wow, that's going to be the higher number. It's going to be telling me that's going to be a greater percentage, and the answer is no. Most of the carbon dioxide is converted to bind to proteins or to bind partly to hemoglobin. And some of it actually is going to be converted into bicarbonate, which is the majority of it. Okay? Bicarbonate is where most of the carbon dioxide is stored, which is why it's so high in amounts. It's up to 120 liters. Now, you have to ask yourself, why would bicarb be so important? Why would the body produce it in such high quantities? And the answer is because it acts as a buffer. Okay, it's a critical buffer in your blood. It's not the critical buffer in your cells, but it's a critical buffer in your blood. Okay? If you drink a bunch of lemonade, let's say right now, okay? Lemonade is not a base, it's an acid. Okay? If that got directly into your bloodstream right away, and you didn't have any buffering capacity, your pH would drop precipitously, and your cells would not be happy. Instead, what the lemonade does is when it crosses across the GI tract into your bloodstream, the bicarb rapidly stabilizes it and maintains a normal pH. These are the huge amounts of stores. You have 120 liters. Now, think about that. That means if I drink 120 liters of lemonade, will I kill the buffering system? Absolutely. So you can drown in lemonade and kill yourself from acidosis. Absolutely. Now, it'd be pretty hard. Most of us would drink 1 or 2 liters of lemonade and go like, enough. Okay? But they've actually had people push it to the limits where they have actually died of rapid changes in pH. But that's really, you have to really attempt at it. You have to really push yourself to do that. Under normal circumstances, most people can't do that. Okay? So when you look at carbon dioxide, this is a really important little drawing, okay, is that in the arterial side, there's really very little of it is dissolved, only 5%. The majority of what you find of carbon dioxide in your blood is bicarbonate, and the bound stuff that's in your arterial side of it is carboamino group, which is basically a protein combination with your CO2. Kind of makes sense, right? If you look at the venous side of it, much more important is still bicarbonate. So the dissolved bicarbonate is still by far the most important system. The buffering, the amount of dissolved doubles, goes from 5 to 10%. And then your carboamino components are 30%. Where did that extra 25% come from?
I mean, think about it. Why the difference? One's arterial and one's venous. Why the difference? Why there's a huge jump in carboamino coming from? Good, you get closer. Okay? A big component of this is hemoglobin. Hemoglobin on your arterial side is not going to carry any CO2 because it's already packed with with O2. Versus once you get to the venous side of it, which is what this venous is, okay, then what happened to the oxygen? It unloaded, okay? And when it unloaded, that extra capacity has now been uptaken by the CO2 to help it run it back. Pretty cool. Okay, so the truck that we're sending out not only sends out oxygen, but it also brings back with it carbon dioxide. Were they going to trick you on a test question? They always try to trick you. Trust me on this one. Okay, they're going to try to trick you. They're going to ask you, which is the majority of carbon dioxide in your blood? And you better answer what? Bicarbonate. Bicarbonate. By far, the greatest amount of carbon dioxide in your bloodstream is bicarbonate. Okay? And it depends on a specific enzyme to convert carbon dioxide and water to carbonic acid. What's it called? Carbonic anhydrase. Carbonic anhydrase. Okay, so if you don't have enough carbonic anhydrase, then you won't form enough bicarb, and you will not have enough buffering capacity. Okay? But by far, what's the major way that you carry carbon dioxide in your bloodstream is bicarbonate. Now, here's something that's also very tricky. Trying to make sure you understand this. Okay. What is the venous PaCO2 like? If I were to tell you to draw blood gas, okay, what would be the normal? Let's do arterial first. Okay, what's the arterial CO2 blood gas going to show? It's going to be 40, right? Okay, so that's my PaCO2. Okay, that's my dissolved carbon dioxide in plasma on the arterial side. What about my venous CO2? When you look at this value, you're going like, man, there must be a lot more carbon dioxide coming back, right? Okay. How much difference is that? 5. So all the other stuff that's bound to hemoglobin is insignificant when you draw blood gas. When you draw a mixed venous blood gas, whenever it comes back, the normal PbO2 is going to be around 45. That's interesting, right? It's only a 5 millimeter gradient. Okay? So when you look at the alveoli, it concentrates to what level? If you had perfect equilibration taking place, where it's going to equilibrate to? It can't go further, it can't go below that. Whatever your arterial side is, that's as low as it can go in the alveoli, if you have good VQ match, or 1-to-1. Does that make sense? Okay. I'm trying to make you think conceptually what's going on. Okay, where does the molecules go? How does it transfer out? Okay. So this little bit of change, so 5 millimeter gradient is enough to push the gas across into the alveoli to make it reach 40. That's pretty amazing if you think about it. CO2 is 20 times more able to transfer across the alveolar than oxygen. So it's very easy for it to come across. So for you to have any problem with diffusion impairment causing carbon dioxide retention is not likely. Not going to happen. Yes?
Okay, that's what I'm trying to tell you, at a BQ of 1. At a BQ of 1. Okay, for optimal transfer of gases, you want to have equal parts perfusion and equal parts ventilation. So you want to have that 1-to-1. Ventilation perfusion should be 1-to-1. If you do that, then your CO2 will basically equilibrate to reach the same levels as arterial CO2. So the value on your alveoli will be 40, and in your capillary, in your arterial side of it, it's going to be 40. Okay? Now, if you change the VQ, if you do it any way, it's going to cause a problem. Okay? It's going to be always negative. Okay? Now, if you're looking at it from the standpoint of what happens if you have no ventilation, or you have dead space. Okay? Well, sorry, if you have shunt, let's say, which the alveoli that you have there are collapsed above. And then the CO2 in that alveoli is going to go up towards the same value as the venous blood is going to be. So that alveoli will fill up with a PCO2, big A CO2, around 45. Okay? If you have another situation where you have dead space, then CO2 will fall rapidly to 0. Because there's no blood, no CO2 transfer. Does that make sense? So it depends on how you ask the question. But if I'm telling you, well, look, you have a normal situation, we have normal VQ or normal ventilation perfusion, what should my value be? And the answer is it should be the same as the arterial blood supply. Okay. Yes? What will happen if you have VQ inequality? The answer will be that normally CO2 will begin to climb a little bit, okay? But what will happen is if you're awake and alert and with it, your brain will immediately increase ventilation and it'll offset the effect, okay? But if you're under anesthesia, you will see a CO2 rise. If you're paralyzed and cannot increase your minute ventilation and you're maintaining the same minute ventilation, CO2 begins to climb with VQ inequalities. Okay? Does that make sense? Right. For you to see the bicarb change, you're depleting a huge store. That's what I'm trying to show you here. This is a huge amount of storage capacity. If you were to measure it in liters, okay, let's say we use each one, and that's a percentage of the liters. Okay, there's only 5% carboamino and 5% dissolved. So when you're looking at CO2 values of 120 liters times 5%, which would be what? 6 liters. So the amount of CO2 that's actually dissolved is 6 liters. The other 6 liters would be bound to your hemoglobin or bound to some form of protein like albumin. And the other 102 or something like that? What is it, 16? It's 12. So 106. So the 106 liters be left would be basically bicarb. Okay, so imagine if you start seeing that number fall, that means you've got a major acidosis. And that's one thing that people don't realize. When you see a bicarbonate, what's your normal bicarbonate value? 24 to 27, depending on who you read, 28 sometimes. So if you see it go down to 18, what has happened? You've almost wiped out maybe a third of your bicarbonate out of the system to basically stabilize the acidosis. That's a significant pH change. I mean, basically buffering change. And that's what the body tries to do. It has a lot of capacity to absorb extra acid. Which is the molecule that's the lowest in your bloodstream, that is tightly controlled?
hydrogen. Hydrogen has the lowest concentration in the blood and is the tightest controlled of all things in your bloodstream. There's constant systems that are in place to try to prevent that from changing very quickly. So you look at CO2 carriage, it's in 3 forms. You have dissolved, okay, which is 20 times more soluble than O2, and about accounts for 10% of the carrying capacity when you're looking at the venous side of it. What you see is that the CO2 comes out of the capillary wall, this is the tissue level, and it dissolves. Okay? It also dissolves in the cytoplasm as well of the red blood cell. But that still only accounts for about 10% of the total. Majority of the CO2 goes through rapid enzymatic breakdown or conversion with what's called carbonic anhydrase, which is a hydrolysis reaction that's taking, not hydrolysis, it's hydrolysis breaking a lot. Water, what's it? No, I can't remember right now. It's adding water to your CO2, which is going to form carbonic acid. Okay, so that's going to be the majority of where your stores are at. Okay, and that's going to convert that into bicarbonate. The bicarbonate is then rapidly extruded out of the cell, and the hydrogen ions are used to help unload the oxygen off the hemoglobin. Okay, which is one of the things that it's going to do. It's going to push off the oxygen off, and that's going to help form the carboamino hemoglobin, which is the carbon dioxide binds to the actual protein. Why is it called carboamino? Amino for amino acid, which is part of proteins. Okay? So you form your carboamino group, which accounts for about, what is it I put down here, 30% when you're in the venous side of it. This is the venous end of it, so that's why you're formed from it. So when you look at the percentages, I wish I had the number in bicarb, but you can do the math. 40, so that means 60% is in here, 60% is bicarbonate. So it's only 10% is dissolved. Majority of it, which is 60%, is bicarbonate, which is now inside your plasma. Bicarbonate is not held in high concentrations inside a red blood cell. It rapidly pushes out the bicarbonate out of the cell and puts it into the actual plasma. Okay? Which is where you want the buffering capacity to be. I mean, the buffering capacity doesn't make sense to be inside the red blood cell. You want it inside the plasma before acid can transfer into a cell and cause problems. Okay? And the way it maintains this kind of electron shift, if you're removing one electron that's negative, what are you going to have to do? Pull in another one that's negative, which is chloride in this case. It's chloride shift. 60% of the carrying capacity is via bicarbonate. It uses the enzyme carbonic anhydrase to cause the reaction to occur rapidly. Bicarbonate diffuses back into the plasma, but the hydrogen cannot. And then chloride, which is called the chloride shift, maintains the neutrality by doing this. The Haldane effect, which is what hydrogen binds to the hemoglobin, that's how you remember it, H to H is Haldane. This reduced hemoglobin has a higher affinity to load CO2 as a consequence. The CO2 carriage is in 3 forms. Like I said before, the last one, 30%, is a carboamino compound, which is 30% of the carrying capacity. And so the CO2 combines with terminal amine groups of blood proteins. So this is another book. So that's like, it's different numbers. I use the numbers that I asked you on is on the one previously. But the book, one of the books that you guys have is the same thing. Shows you slightly different numbers. I don't know why they have slightly different numbers, but use the ones that I used before. If you look at the oxygen dissociation curve, it's much more linear, okay, than oxygen dissociation. And because of that, you have, if you hyperventilate somebody, you can get a rapid removal of CO2, versus if you hypoventilate, you also get a rapid accumulation of CO2 as well. Most of the time you don't notice it because, of course, a person will have an increase in sensor activity, and as a consequence causes the CO2 to be expressed by increasing ventilation. When you're looking at blood gas tissue exchange, the abnormal PO2 can be caused by several things. Okay? The most important thing is immediately think about hypoxemia. So think about hyperventilation, diffusion impairment, shunt, or BQ inequality. The other thing you got to think about also is that sometimes your PO2 can drop, even though when everything is normal, if your delivery is not adequate. Either you're uptaking too much, which is you extract so much oxygen that you're depleting the hemoglobin coming back, or you're not getting enough oxygen to the tissue by having a low cardiac output state. So If you look at delivery, it's a two-part equation, which is a carrying capacity, which is CaO2, which is a 1.39 times the hemoglobin times the saturation times the plus the PaO2 times 0.003 times the cardiac output. And so if you have a low cardiac output or low oxygen carrying capacity from either hemoglobin, abnormal hemoglobin, or carbon monoxide poisoning, this can all lead to a drop in your PaO2. If, of course, you have a low alveolar oxygen tension, diffusion, shunt, VQ inequality, this is all part of that. And, of course, your hyperventilation. And then you can also have reduction in tissue perfusion, such as thrombi or shock, or inability for tissue to take up oxygen can also be an issue, too. You can actually have cyanide poisoning. Where's the most common form of cyanide poisoning we see medically? Nitroprusside. Nitroprusside can cause cyanide poisoning after a while. How do you pick up that you have nitroprusside cyanide poisoning? Right, SVO2, very good. So what happens to your SVO2? It goes up. It goes up, which is kind of strange, okay? The reason it's going up is because it's not being uptaken, the oxygen is not being uptaken by the tissue. It now is inhibiting the uptake at the tissue level. What cyanide does is it poisons the mitochondria. Okay, so there's no reason for the oxygen to be uptaken by the cell anymore. Okay?